Okay, picture a Viking in your head right now. What do you see? For centuries, the word Viking has conjured up a very specific, almost, cartoonish image in our minds. We immediately picture these towering, bloodthirsty marauders, probably wearing those historically inaccurate horned helmets, arriving on foggy shores with one single-minded goal, just to plunder, burn, and destroy everything in sight. And honestly, it makes sense why we think that. It's an image that's been totally burned into our collective consciousness by centuries of pop culture, movies, and most importantly, the absolutely terrified accounts written by their ancient enemies. But what if I told you that this story we've all been sold is actually missing an incredible amount of depth? The truth is, looking at history strictly through the eyes of the victims only ever gives you half the picture. And correcting this record, well, it really matters today because it shows us how extreme environments forge incredible human ingenuity. So in today's Explainer, we're going to look strictly at the archaeological and historical evidence to uncover the totally fascinating, multifaceted truth of the Norse people. We're getting past the myth, right down to the facts. So, here is our roadmap for the Explainer today. First up, we'll examine the 9th century Viking nightmare. Number 2, escaping the dust veil. 3, master engineers of the sea. 4, parliaments and meticulous hygiene. 5, the independent Viking woman. And finally, number 6, pirates or a civilization. We're going to cover the nightmares they caused, the environmental disasters they survived, their incredible maritime technology, and their surprisingly progressive domestic life. All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, the 9th century Viking nightmare and the legend of Ragnar Lothbrok. This is really the visible tip of the iceberg, the absolute terror that struck Northern Europe. This right here is the central question we really must ask ourselves when looking at how isolated northern seafarers just suddenly transformed into this formidable continental force. I mean, when you read the historical records from the perspective of the monks and the kings they attacked, it's incredibly easy to see exactly why the whole savage pirate narrative took such a strong hold. Take the famous raid on the Lindisfarne Monastery. This was in the year 793. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles, which were written by monks, literally sitting by candlelight, describe the Vikings appearing like a sudden, violent storm. I'm not exaggerating. They wrote of lightning flashes, fiery dragons seen flying in the air, and literal famine following in their wake. To these chroniclers, the Vikings weren't just an invading army. Actually, it was way worse than that. They were viewed as a literal punishment from the heavens, sent down to exact divine wrath. Now put yourself in the shoes of a European king at this time. Imagine it. You have spent immense, frankly mind-boggling resources to fortify your cities. You've established these massive, heavily armored land armies, and you are completely 100% confident in your defensive strategy. And then, suddenly, out of nowhere, these unknown warriors just completely bypass your borders entirely. They sweep rapidly through England, utilizing rivers as highways, and literally knock on your front door before your troops can even lace up their boots. The psychological warfare of that was just immense. So the sheer historical terror associated with figures like Ragnar Lothbrok, it perfectly sets up that savage stereotype because to the medieval European establishment, this was an unbeatable continental nightmare, and it lasted for centuries. But we have to ask, why did they leave their homes to raid in the first place? That brings us to Section 2, escaping the dust veil. This was the true catalyst for their expansion. So the absolutely crucial point here revolves around the year AD 536. Now, this year is infamously known to historians as perhaps the worst year to be alive in human history. A massive volcanic eruption, or possibly a series of eruptions, created this devastating dust veil event. It completely plunged Northern Europe into extreme climatic hardship. The Byzantine historian Procopius actually wrote about this. He noted that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, basically looking just like the moon, for an entire year. Can you imagine that? The temperatures completely plummeted. Summer essentially just vanished. Think about being a farmer in Scandinavia during this time. Your crops completely fail. They just rot right there in the frozen ground. Starvation sets in almost immediately. It was a true, desperate fight for survival in a frozen, darkened landscape that had practically turned against human life overnight. In fact, this brutal period is highly likely what inspired the Norse myth of Fimbulwinter, the incredibly harsh winter that supposedly precedes the end of the world. This sequence of events reveals exactly how generations of surviving an unforgiving climate forged a remarkably resilient people who would eventually burst outwards across the globe. We start with the sheer, unmatched devastation of AD 536. For centuries after that dust veil, these isolated seafarers endured brutal, freezing conditions. But human beings adapt. Because the land could no longer sustain them with traditional farming, they had no choice. They had to turn to the sea. They spent generations perfecting their fishing, their navigation, and their resourcefulness just to put basic food on the table. By the time the 9th century rolls around, this intensely forged resilience and this desperate need for resources triggers a sudden, explosive maritime expansion. And once they started, they kept going, eventually pushing as far south as the Spanish Peninsula and even beyond.
So the big takeaway from all of this is that they didn't just expand out of pure bloodlust or a desire to just break things. This was a highly calculated push for survival and resources, completely born from extreme environmental desperation. The harsh climate literally forced their adaptation. Scarcity breeds innovation, right? They had to look outward for the resources, the arable land, and the wealth that their own frozen territories could just no longer provide. This environmental push fundamentally shifted their entire society's trajectory. It turned a disparate bands of struggling, freezing farmers into a fiercely expansive, highly coordinated society on the hunt for a better future.
To understand exactly how they actually pulled this off physically, let's look at Section 3, Master Engineers of the Sea, and their ingeniously engineered ships, because you simply cannot execute a massive maritime expansion without world-class engineering. The specific maritime engineering of the Viking longship gave them an absolute, undeniable tactical advantage over the much heavier European fleets of the time. Let's break down the physics here, because it's fascinating. First off, they had these advanced, clinker-built hulls. Instead of placing heavy wooden planks end-to-end like European shipbuilders did, the Vikings overlapped the planks and riveted them together. This made the hull incredibly light and, crucially, flexible. When hitting massive, rough ocean waves, a rigid European ship would just shatter under the pressure. But the Viking ship, it would literally bend and glide over the water. It's brilliant. Furthermore, their shallow drafts meant the bottom of the ship sat only a few feet deep in the water. They didn't need a deep water port at all. They could sail across a deep, violent ocean and then transition straight up a shallow, muddy inland river. Add to that a totally symmetrical design, where the front and back were completely identical. This meant they could instantly row in reverse without taking the precious time to slowly, clumsily turn a massive ship completely around. These precise engineering steps basically shifted the entire balance of power in history. Let's just walk through a hypothetical raid to see this in action. The Vikings cross vast, treacherous oceans safely, totally undetected. Dawn is breaking as they hit the French or English coast. Now, instead of stopping at a heavily fortified coastal castle, which is what the Europeans expected, they instantly transitioned to sailing straight up an extremely shallow inland river, completely gliding silently past all the main coastal defenses. They target an inland monastery or a bustling trading hub, launching a lightning-fast surprise raid deep within foreign territory. They load up the silver, the goods, the resources, and by the time the local armies finally hear the alarm bells and mobilize their heavy cavalry to try and trap them in the river, the Vikings have already loaded their ships, simply reversed direction thanks to that symmetrical design, and vanished back down the river into the morning mist. I mean, it was an absolute tactical masterpiece. All right, now we move to Section 4, Parliaments and Meticulous Hygiene. This is where we really start shattering the savage stereotype. Let's dive deeper beneath the iceberg surface and look at the actual domestic reality of their society. There is just a stark, almost unbelievable juxtaposition between the scary stories told by their enemies and the actual archaeological facts of their civilization. On one hand, you have the enduring myth, unwashed, completely lawless marauders acting purely on violent impulse. But on the other hand, the reality reveals something deeply fascinating. When we actually excavate their settlements, we find meticulous hygiene routines, a highly structured, organized society bound by strict social codes, and incredibly, the existence of some of Europe's earliest democratic parliaments. While so much of Europe was heavily ruled by absolute monarchs with completely unquestioned centralized power, the Vikings were out there planting the seeds of democratic, organized legislation. They held these open-air assemblies, which were known as the Thing. And this wasn't just some chaotic, lawless mob shouting at each other. No, it was a sophisticated, highly structured gathering where free Vikings came together to vote. They even had law speakers, people whose entire job was to memorize the entire legal code and recite it to the assembly. It was at the Thing that they debated politics, passed new laws, collectively settled civil disputes and blood feuds, and made major communal decisions. Every single free person had a voice, making it a remarkably participatory legal system for the medieval era.
And what about that whole unwashed barbarian myth? Yeah, that is completely busted. Archaeological sources confirm they were actually among the cleanest Europeans of the entire 9th century. Excavations all across Scandinavia and Britain have uncovered literally thousands of incredibly advanced hygiene tools. We're talking beautifully carved bone combs, precision tweezers, nail cleaners, and even these tiny little ear spoons used specifically to remove earwax. In fact, there is a very famous historical account from an English chronicler named John of Wallingford. He actually wrote a complaint that the Vikings were too clean. He wrote that they bathed every single Saturday, they combed their hair every day, and they frequently changed their clothes. And apparently, this made them entirely too attractive to the local English noblewomen. It's wild how different that is from the movies. This brings us to Section 5, the independent Viking woman, and their unprecedented societal rights. The historical findings here are truly remarkably ahead of their time. Viking women lived under a societal framework that granted them an astonishingly independent status compared to the rest of the world at that time. They had the legal right to own property and land completely in their own name, and they could inherit wealth directly. If a marriage failed or if it became abusive, a Viking woman could officially request a divorce. To do this, she simply had to declare her intention in front of witnesses, often doing it once at the couple's bedside and once at the threshold of the house. Upon divorcing, she possessed the absolute legal right to reclaim her dowry and take her wealth right back with her. In 9th century Europe, this level of autonomy and financial protection was basically unheard of. This really matters today because it highlights that human progress isn't just a straight, simple line. While they were utterly feared abroad as ruthless conquerors, back at home, Viking society was pioneering early concepts of civil liberties. I mean, consider the practical reality of their lifestyle, with the men frequently away on long maritime journeys, raiding or trading for months or sometimes even years at a time. The women were left entirely in charge. They effectively managed the massive agricultural estates, the wealth, the trade networks, and the local societal structures. They were the economic engines of the society. Very often, a prominent Viking woman would carry a ring of keys at her belt, serving as this powerful, highly respected visual symbol of her ultimate authority over the household and all of its resources. Finally, we reach Section 6, Pirates or a Civilization. Let's bring all these incredible sources together to fundamentally reevaluate history and reconstruct our final, comprehensive view of who the Vikings really were. The full narrative we've uncovered in this explainer reveals that the terror, it was indeed real, absolutely, but it was just the very tip of a massive, incredibly complex civilization. The bloody legends of Ragnar Lothbrok and the brutal coastal raids must be balanced by the historical fact that they were desperate, highly resilient survivors of the catastrophic AD 536 dust veil. The European nightmares were delivered not by mindless brutes, but by absolute genius maritime engineers who fully master the physics of the oceans. The so-called lawless pirates were actually the builders of some of early history's most structured, participatory democratic parliaments. And the assumed brutal patriarchs were part of a progressive culture that championed women's independence and civil liberties in a way the rest of Europe couldn't even fathom at the time. History is so rarely as simple as the one-sided stories we like to tell ourselves. By looking strictly at the evidence, we discover a people forced by a hostile, freezing climate to innovate, to survive, and to expand, creating a highly organized, technologically advanced, and remarkably nuanced society along the way. So, I want to leave you with this provocative thought, to challenge everything you thought you knew about this era. Next time you hear the word Viking, will you picture a mindless pirate? Or will you picture the architect of a remarkably resilient civilization? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.